Welcome to the Beverage Click podcast, discussions revolving around drinks with an Asian perspective. I'm your resident host, Sean O, certified drink specialist and co-founder of the Beverage Click Academy in Southeast Asia. And here is this month's episode. Welcome back, my drinking comrades, to another episode of the Beverage Click podcast. If you've caught our last episode, you'll know we have embarked on a deep dive into the history of California wine with none other than Master Sommelier Evan Goldstein. Well, the journey doesn't stop there. Today, we continue with part 2 of this incredible masterclass. From the foundations of California's wine legacy to its evolution and innovation, we now turn our focus to the modern era and what the future holds for this dynamic region. Once again, a big thank you to Capstone California for making this deep dive possible. So grab a glass and settle in. Here's part 2 of the episode.
All right, everybody, part 2, have a seat. Here we go. So now we're going to move on, and we're going to hit 6 through 12 and a bunch of other things. So let's start with some fun stuff. By 1900, the American wine industry, as you can imagine, based on what we were saying, was really prospering. You know, global things, railways, all these other things made wine available, not just in California, not just to a handful of presidents, but to everybody else who wanted to drink it. So we were selling wine all across the United States. We were selling wine as far away as Australia, Central America, England, Asia, California wine was happening. Things were progressing. And then all of a sudden, 1999, Prohibition hits. And the outlawing of wine was something that happened literally overnight. California's wine production fell to 94%, down to 6% of production, almost instantaneously. It really sucked. There were exceptions to this, as we know. If you were making wine for medical purposes, that was okay. If you were making wine for religious and sacramental purposes, that was okay. We say that in this period of time, a lot of people got sick and a lot of people found religion. Just sort of so it all happened. The other thing that happened, which a lot of people don't know, is the Volstead Act passed, which was basically the precursor to the home winemaking thing. Everybody was allowed to basically bring in 200 gallons of non-fermented products to then drink. You know, and then wink, wink, nod, nod. You could let them go through, again, just let them open the things up. They'll ferment, et cetera, and people could make wine. So that was really the only good thing that happened. But bottom line is very few wineries survived during this period of time. It was really, really awful. And it remained awful for most people until 1933. We'll talk a little bit about that more, but people certainly were very happy by the time repeal came along. Interestingly, I thought it would be fun to show you, we talked earlier about that period of time where people, from a vinifera standpoint, when there was no Cabernet, there was no Pinot Noir, it was all Carignan and Zin and Grenache. Back in the whites, look at this, around 1920. Look at what the grapes were. Chardonnay isn't even on the list, right? The number one grape was Burger, right? There was grapes for like a little bit of Riesling, God bless, a little bit of Sauvignon, Semillon, Colombard, right, called Colombard back then, Green Hungarian, crazy, Buchra, who knew, right? But grapes have changed over time. So it's once in a while, it's just important to stop, get some data, and look at things, because we all have a tendency to think of the most recent stuff as being what it is. And I will tell you, particularly a lot of younger people who are just learning about wine think that this all just fell out of the sky one day and it was there. So a simple glance at a chart like that makes you realize how far we've come in just a 100-year period. And 100 years in the grand scheme of wine is a very short period of time. So what happened during Prohibition? Well, we talked about it. Grape juice was sold in barrels. SO2 was added to that. That was one of the things we talked about before in spoilage and things like that, things that people did learn. And then what they did, people would open the barrels. This was their 200 gallons. And then when enough air got there, what happened? Fermentation started. So it turned the grape juice into wine. So this is how people kind of skirted the issue, was knowing they were buying grape juice, but knowing that as soon as it opened, ultimately it would ferment and they'd have their wine. That was great. Most of the vintners were sort of stuck in a really difficult place because they couldn't do it. Again, this was we talk about it like everybody was doing it. Not that many people were doing it. So most people had to abandon their land, let the vines go fallow, sell their land, declare bankruptcy. It was an awful time. Those people that were lucky could sell wines for sacrament at their best. However, there was a very interesting thing that came out of this. At time, if you want to deep dive, look up something called raisin cakes. And raisin cakes were basically these sort of crushed, sort of like a deconcentrated wine, dehydrated wine, that if you bought these raisin cakes and added water back into them, added grape juice back into them, over time, it would allow them to start fermenting. So it's basically like making dehydrated wine. So a lot of people got around the wine thing by selling so-called raisin cakes and then letting the word get out. So that and the loophole to that. Bottom line is, prior to Prohibition, there were 2,500 wineries licensed to make wine in America. By the time repeal happened, and obviously rebirth or renaissance started, there were less than 100 that were left that managed to survive in that time. It was a horrific period, and one that we are very glad is well behind us at this point in time. What else happened? So in 1933, being the smart marketeers and folks that they are, Ernest and Julio started E&J Gallo down in Modesto, the largest winery in the world, still one of the most forward-thinking wineries in the world today, still privately owned. You know, the list of accomplishments of the Gallo family, both in wine, in G3, in their packaging, largest purveyors of glass, largest purveyors of cardboard. I mean, they are amazing. That's all I can say. 1 year later, the Wine Institute was formed to do that. And obviously that's important because none of us would be here without the Wine Institute. We love the Wine Institute. 1935, again, all this thing happened in rapid succession, was the year that University of California, specifically at Berkeley, but even more so at Davis, really began to lead viticulture and winemaking research. Maynard Amarine came onto the play. He was one of the first faculty hired at Davis to sort of keep things going. And you could just feel this entire air of positivity come into an industry that had just been in the doldrums and essentially shut down for such a long period of time. Then we had this guy Andre came along, right? And Andre Chelichev, if anybody here ever had the fortune, the privilege of meeting little Andre, I mean, just the most amazing man. He, obviously Russian, was hired by Georges de Latour because he was doing consulting in Bordeaux and stuff like that too. And he moved from California to California from France back in 1938. Now remember again a lot of these parallels. So a lot of these things are kind of all happening at the same time. We were talking at break, a couple of us, about, you know, when did Oak happen and when did all these happen, and he was certainly part of it. We'll talk about the Zeller box later and Hanzell too. But Andre, I mean, if you look at the list, and these are just sort of like some of the top 5 accomplishments of things that he brought in. But he was the first person in California to really start thinking about frost protections and bringing in smudge pots. And again, his experiences in Bordeaux, saying that, you know, this is the way you protect during the growing seasons and all that. He was the first person to really pioneer sanitation. He was the first person for Bordeaux varieties. We'll talk about Burgundian varieties later with the Zell, but for Bordeaux varieties, to bring people and get them to think about using small French oak barrels for the aging of wine back in the 30s, right? He was the first person to really help people understand and recognize and insist that ML became part of the winemaking process, and understanding, particularly in the case of red wines, where mastery of ML and where you're doing it and not to bottle too early and things like that were going to be very, very important to do that. He was the first person to suggest eliminating, again, all wine was basically pasteurized. One of the other things you could do to make sure wines were sanitized and wouldn't go bad, pasteurization, and introducing the idea of cold fermentations, trying to bring your temperatures down, or picking when things were cold, concentrating of the wine, the whole idea of, again, saignéing a little bit. And then modern viticulture practices came in, replanting vineyards over time when the vineyards weren't giving you what you wanted. And, you know, while old vines and, you know, 0.75 hectare things are fine for Zinfandel and maybe for Petit Syrah and things like that, not very helpful with Cabernet and Chardonnay, right? You need some volumes and they don't get better. Reducing the amount of sulfur used in the vineyards was something that he did. Planting high quality French grape varieties and moving away from that pattern of a lot of just whatever was there, a lot of which were what? Vestiges of Herasti, who was just bringing over everything and playing it everywhere. So he worked amazingly. And he, talk about genes, Talk about incredible genes. He literally worked until he passed away at the age of 93 years old in 1994. So, not that long ago, arguably, one of the handful of most important people in the history of California wine was living, breathing, and active in that. Just amazing. And if you had the luxury and privilege of meeting him, which I had the privilege of meeting him just a couple times, he was an amazing man. So let's go to the 40s during this period of time. Obviously, after Prohibition, we talked about Gallo, we talked about things coming back, we talked about Wine Institute, we've talked about UC Davis and Berkeley and all that. Wine was starting to happen again, and Napa Valley was literally at a premium end, leading a charge to becoming active. So plantings became ferocious. So basically almost 6,000 acres or 2,400 plus hectares were planted in a very rapid succession to get things back on track, with people understanding. There beginning to be an understanding that these premium areas, that Napa Valley was in fact a premium area, as both word spread, again, pre-Prohibition exports and all that. The things people found were, where were most of these wines coming from? Not Cucamonga, sadly, but they were coming from Napa, they were coming from Sonoma. So even then, the branding, if you will, of two renowned premium regions in California took hold. Obviously that started. Interestingly enough, other characters came in. Louis Martini came in, and he and his winery were amongst the first people to start bottling single variety or mono variety wines. Wines prior to that were pretty much blends. Hardy Burgundy, Golden Chablis, Sauterne without an S. Things like that all were byproducts of time where people were making wines to emulate styles and not necessarily thinking by grape types, and persevering and using grape types more often than not 100% back then, but even then the first inklings of thinking about blending happened. Then in the and by the way, Inglenook was among the first making single variety Cabernet Sauvignon back in 1934. Fascinating, right? In the 50s, the other side of this, on the Sonoma side, so you had André focusing on Bordelais varieties on one side. Over in Sonoma County, where we're going to spend a lot of time, the grapes they were becoming increasingly renowned for because of the climate profile, the proximity of the coast, et cetera, were increasingly Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And that sort of started to become the buzz of what was going on. And again, it was an individual, probably somebody that, well, you guys all know, you've done the Capstone stuff, but James Zellerbach, who was the ambassador to Italy of all places. I'm sitting here trying to make the Burgundy-Italy connection happen in my head. I haven't figured it out yet. But he was the first person to encourage people to start using French oak wine, small barrels, specifically for Pinot Noir and for Chardonnay, and was amongst the first people to really use nitrogen during the racking to bottling process for the preservation of quality. So he was sort of at the forefront, him and Brad Webb, who was his winemaker at Hanzell at the time, but other people sort of followed in the footsteps. So from this, again, everything leads to something else. From this is where Joe Rocchioli started. From this is where Joe Swan started, learning about this, preserving the techniques, working with specifically Burgundian techniques on the varieties that they know and loved well. So obviously the focus started to become pronounced that this was Pinot and this was Chardonnay land and stuff like that. And even the things like Zinfandel that we're doing, I don't know if if you can ever find a bottle of the late 60s, 68, 69 vintages of Swan Zinfandel. He didn't like alcohol. He didn't make anything above 13.2 alcohol. He would even label his Zinfandels as light wine, right? Because to show them the Zinfandels didn't have to be heavy. And some of those very early wines were in the high 13s in a very distinctive, different style of what was going on. So all this stuff coming on, people started thinking about the advents of where the fruit was coming from. So the Swan Pinot became a known. And we were talking a little bit earlier, so we've spoken about really two varieties. We talked about the importance of Quintanin in Cabernet and bringing that over from Margaux. We talked about the importance of Wente in Chardonnay, bringing it here. And then really the third other source of primary plant material was Parmesan. And Parmesan brought it down to closer to the Santa Cruz Mountains, basically, essentially Silicon Valley, Santa Clara area, and then it got propagated from there. It became sort of isolated and made more famous, if you will. Parmesan ultimately gave his plant material to Martin Ray, right? And Martin Ray became sort of the precursor. Mount Eden got it from Martin Ray, and then a lot of people subsequently got it from Mount Eden. Joe Swan got his Pinot Noir from Mount Eden. So his clone actually goes back there. So all these different stories intersect. You just need to go back and sleuth and do interesting stuff to make and figure out where it happened. Now things are starting to get popular. We start to move into the 50s. We start to move into the 60s. And it was really during the period of the early 60s, sort of Mad Men period. You remember that? The advertising firm started. And the whole idea of thinking about advertising and branding was going on here. And I pulled this out of the archives, if you will. This is on Gallo, then and to the day, still amongst the leaders of great advertising. And this is a great print thing, and Christopher and I were talking during the break about how, if you're fortunate to come by some of these old posters and old things, which are, you got to dig, but you're available there. You can find them out there and frame them, showing how wine was presented. Orson Welles will drink no wine before it's time. All that stuff came out of this whole era. But note on the label that wines back then, fine wines, were named not by grapes, not necessarily by vineyards, but an emulation of styles, an emulation of a Burgundy, an emulation of a Sauterne. There it is with no S, right? Emulation of Chablis, sherry, port, whatever. Now we know that generics have now all been basically kicked out with varying grandfathering phasing that's done that, but that's how people drunk. And literally to today, you know, you can go to Cyprus and drink sherry. You can go to places and drink port and stuff like that. So all that stuff is being phased out and being once again brought back to provenance as being the driver of these things and not necessarily style. But that was what it was like back then. That's what California wines were doing back then. Again, it was just, you know, varietals were starting, but the lion's share of wine was sold this way. By the way, all men looked like George Clooney back then. I thought I would just point that out, and all were going to be in Mad Men or something like that. So that was happening in print, right? Wine was starting to become, dare I say, a little bit more mainstream, right, in the vernacular of population. When you can see it in a magazine, it's mainstream. When you can see it on TV, it's mainstream too. Food and wine, you know, now we have Gordon Ramsay and he does all this fun stuff. but back then we had people like, you know, Julia Child, you know, who is literally bringing gourmet food, admittedly very heavy on the French stuff, to that, and having wine on her TV show, bringing wine to the American public in their living rooms, in their kitchens, in their dining rooms, and help spreading that wine was slowly becoming more mainstream. If you grew up in a household in California, but frankly anywhere in the United States back then, people were drinking cocktails. That's what it was. It was a cocktail culture. Wine was just, unless you had people who had spent time in Europe, a lot of the wine culture in the United States came back and was birthed into our culture on the East Coast side from people who were coming back or coming over after the war and bringing roots from France, roots from Italy, roots from that there, and bringing that wine culture there and then sharing it with other people. So there are multiple ways in which that happened. California was clearly at a forefront on our side, but again, it was kind of a national campaign. And it wasn't just advertising. I brought this here. You can thumb through it later. This was published in 1963. Okay, this was a book that is favorite recipes of California winemakers in our effort in California to start getting the wineries to do that. So this was collectively published by the Wine Advisory Board, I might add, and you go through it, and aside from a whole primer on wine styles and wine uses and different cocktails and punches, which were the gateway drug, if you will, into drinking wine at table there's a whole series of just really interesting recipes and all that, donated by winemakers and vineyard owners and stuff like that. Just an amazing thing. But birthing what we know today as something that is very part of the DNA of California, which is, you know, wine and food at table. That's a very important part of what we do. I'm going to reel back a little bit. I want you to pick up glass of wine number 6. Now, a lot of you, oh, it's a white wine, Evan. It's probably warmed up a little bit. But, you know, really good Chardonnay needs to be closer to room temperature anyway. And this is the 2002 vintage of Hanzell's Chardonnay. Obviously 100% Chardonnay, most all of which are heirloom clone, and most all of it coming from a multiple of old blocks, sort of 13 different hectares put this together. Probably the single most important block in there is what they refer to as the Ambassador's 1953 block. That is the original block. That is the block that housed what is now known as the Hanzell clone. The Hanzell clone is the Wente clone that went to Stony Hill, and the McRaes were kind enough to sell some to Brad Webb, who may have actually taken it from the vineyards when he was visiting with the McRaes, I don't know, but and planting it there too. So again, all of these things are interconnected, but there are a lot of other older clonal things, most of which are selections from that vineyard replanted, the Day Vineyard, the DeBry Vineyard, the Ramos Vineyard, the Zellerbach Vineyard, blocks within the vineyards and adjacent vineyards, all there, all sharing a sort of rocky, volcanic clay loam soil. And again, showing off the whole idea that, again, before Hanzell, people weren't using Burgundian techniques. People treated Chardonnay probably the way they treated Cabernet, probably treated the way everything else was. And these were sort of some of the forefront efforts in doing this and showing you, by using good techniques, using things like nitrogen for bottling to preserve and stuff like that, you could make wines. This is a 22 going on 23-year-old California Chardonnay. Quite a treat, right, to have something like that. There was certainly, it depended on where you were. I mean, clearly people like this is more of the emerging boutique end of the wine industry. But it's not like all of a sudden all these people were here. So, you know, there were, when I was going up to wine country back in the 70s, you know, early on in my career, you're supposed to say I don't look that old, but you'll get that next time, okay? There were like 6 places you could visit in Napa Valley, right? There were not that many. Equally that same number in Sonoma County when Dave Stair opened up Dry Creek in, what was it, 1972. That was the first new winery in Dry Creek Valley since Prohibition, right? So a lot of this stuff was new. And at the smaller boutique end of new people getting into it, that was the case. But the lion's share of fruit that was produced was larger and volume, and people were doing blends and all that too. So people deciding to craft in on single variety wine, single styles of wine, were then looking at what made them special and things like that. So it was, oak, individual selections of grapes, all those things. All this is, again, everything all the time, like the movie, right, happening. But they were considered at the tip of the spear in Hanzell quality. I mean, I had the luxury of buying an old cellar at my old restaurant and, you know, selling it off to do that. And the pride and joy of my collection was a 57 Hanzell Chardonnay that we sold in the mid-'80s that was still alive, cooking, and I had a case of it, and it was incredible. These are just joys. These are little treats and things like that. So anyway, that's the Hyde clone, again, where it came from. And again, you had other clones. I talked to you before about the Parmesan and going to Martin Ray and all that too. So enjoy that wine, and it's going to keep opening up in the glass, I might add as well too. All right, let's move on to wine number 7. I love Joe Swan dearly. I'll tell you what Joe Swan's story in a minute. And I love Rod Berglund, who is his son-in-law, who is still making the wines today. Rod is not the best and most meticulous bookkeeper on things like that. So the only way, I didn't have it, I sleuthed online. If you want to know the ABV on the wine, go look at the bottle, but I couldn't find it there. But this is a 1983. So how many of you have had a 40-year-old California Pinot Noir from a pedigreed producer before? This is, again, a real treat as we move into Glass of Wine 7. This wine, which was bottled back then as a Northern Sonoma Estate Pinot Noir, was renamed, many of you know it today, as the Trenton Estate. And Trenton is the name of the town that used to be where in Laguna Ridge where it sits. We told you a little bit of the story about the Swan and the Swan clone. Joe Swan's pedigree. Joe planted his Pinot Noirs, original Pinot Noir clones. This was a Zinfandel vineyard originally. He took it over in 1967 at the age of 45. He had spent a lot of time with Andrei Chelichev, who will tell you that the first and most pronounced Burgundy he ever made was Louis Martini's, or Pinot Noir was Louis Martini's Burgundy. I believe it was either 1940 or 1943, simply labeled as Burgundy at the time, but showing you the prowess of Carneros at a time when people were just learning to discover it. He and Joe became friends. He encouraged Joe to do that and, in fact, helped him identify the clone that was there. They, again, went down to get it from Mount Eden, and they say that very much the way the Concanon clone came from Chateau Margaux. Rumor has it, another great thesis idea, is that the clone for Martin Ray, Parmesan, came from Clos de Vougeot as a suitcase clone at some point in time. Anecdotal, if somebody can find the proof, that would be awesome. And if somebody wants to disprove that and share the new truth with us, that would be cool too. But anyway, so it was originally a field selection. It became propagated and known over time. Many people came to Joe to do that, and that's why it's become known today as the Swan clone. But it's really amazing, and the wines are incredible. Chelichev consulted, helped him out, etc. Joe passed in 1989, and his son-in-law, Rod, is married to Joe's daughter, June, has been carrying on the tradition. Something that I want you to remember tonight, there's an interesting connection between being an airline pilot and being in the wine business. Joe Swan used to be an airline pilot for Western Airlines, the only way to fly, right? And Tom Burgess, who you're going to learn about Burgess a little bit later when we're over in Napa, was a pilot as well too. Jack Chambers, who was the leading distributor of fine wines in San Francisco and has a distributorship in Hawaii, was also a pilot. So I don't know what this pilot thing is. Maybe another good thesis paper. Who were the pilots in Europe who were doing it? Dan Costa's dad, Aurelio Montes down in Chile, is a pilot as well too. So there must be something about flying and doing that. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying this wine. Again, for a 40-year-old Pinot Noir, and also some of the nicest people you will ever meet. Rod, when we did this program last time, we showed the 84. When we went back to him to ask again, he said, "Nah, Evan, I can't really do it." I'm like, "What?" He goes, "You finished my 84 less than 1 or 2 bottles that I kept for myself, and if I don't give those to you, I hope you're okay with that." I'm like, "No." Totally goes, "But I just tasted through recently. I'll let you have some of the 83 instead." So he was the only vintner that actually went further back. I just thought that was incredible. But speaks to both the man, speaks to a generosity about Sonoma County that you're going to see when you get there, and how affable and approachable and down to earth and generous and altruistic the folks are there. There you go. There are now 12 different, by the way, Swan selections, if you will, that are there. Not all of them are called Swan clone, but people have repropagated them in their vineyards. But you know, and I'll tell you another story, just to tell you how serious the vintners take it. What we asked them, the premise for this thing is because it is a history of California wine class. Go back into your cellar and if you're able, and obviously some people don't have cellars, that's why you've got some current vintages, go back and show the oldest wine that you have inventory on and that you think is reflecting itself really, really well. So I think that's very much case in point, that rather than saying, I'm going to skip ahead to, 5 years, 8 years later or whatever, going back a year, because I think that wine shows the thing. And by the way, I have in my bag, if anyone wants to see it, his wine tags that are written 83 Pinot Noir, sent them on the bottles. That's classic Rod. So let's move now to wine 8 and another treat. So this is our tribute to Andre. Okay, this is the BV Private Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon, 1981. So I want you to notice the theme, if you go back to the Beringer that we had before, and we'll look forward a little bit too, that alcohol levels were much more modest. Wines were different. You'll notice that both in the Beringer and in this one, Cabernet Sauvignon is indeed a cross of Cab Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. Back then, there was a lack of understanding. That's just how they were picking their fruit, doing it by refractometers and numbers and stuff like that. But the Cabernets back then leaned into their pyrozinic character a little bit more. They all had a slightly greener edge, which again, we are coming back to today. Some people never stop. Kathy Corison, clean as a whistle, still does it the same way every period of time. But a lot of wineries have undulated between classic styles, bigger styles, and going back now towards classic styles. There's something to be said for the elegance of these wines back then at the time. So this wine is an amazing, and this sort of saw part of this whole thing, and again shows you that. So a quick story about this wine. So BV, as a winery, as many of you know, was established back in 1900. And Georges de Latour and his wife, Fernand, came over from France, settled in, found that incredible estate in the heart of the Napa Valley, got there, settled the estate there, and started making wine. So the grapes were grown and all that. Ultimately, George passed in 1940, so he never saw the release of this wine, which happened in 1941. Not this wine, but the BV Private Reserve. So the first wine was actually in 1936, between barrel age and bottle age, right? The wine took a few years to get out. Andrei Chelychev, who was clearly the winemaker back then, tasted the wine in 1936, which to the day is still 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, and said, wow, this is it. This is what we need to do. He very rarely, he said that on that 40s Burgundy that Martini did, because again, he was a consultant back then as well too. He said we should bottle this, we should sell this, and this should be the flagship winery. the flagship wine from the winery. So the wine was simply labeled back then Private Reserve, right? And then by Georges de Latour. And over time, obviously, it was Cabernet Sauvignon. Varietal labeling became more important, and it was done there. But that was the first thing. I think the saddest piece of this was simply the fact that he wasn't there to taste it upon its release. But it was the first release of 41. And Andre was responsible for a long time there, and the BV Private Reserve became a calling card for California Cabernet Napa Valley Sauvignon, Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon for the longest period of time. He retired in 1973, so everything from 41 to 73 was Andre's. After 73, he handed it off to now a small series of winemakers, but he came back in 1991 for a couple of years to taste before he passed away. And to honor him, BV makes a wine called Maestro that many of you have probably heard of before, that is the homage wine to Andre, which I think is touching, telling, fitting for Andre, a delicious wine. Now, what's really interesting about this wine comparatively is you look stylistically, and obviously you're looking at two wines. The differences in distance between BV and Beringer are not huge, right? I mean, they're both sort of central sweet spot of the valley, yet the styles are very different. And there's an elegance about the BV Private Reserve, which I think is always carried through in their wines. Ed Spraja, if you've ever met Ed, they say that people's wines taste like their winemakers oftentimes look, or people look like their dogs over time or whatever. Ed's a big guy. Ed makes big, bold styles of wines and, worked with Myron on that. And over time, from the very earliest, the vintages that Ed was completely in charge of at Beringer over time before Laurie Hook took over, just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. A little bit more restraint now and doing that. But I think the BV Private Reserve has always been about elegance, has always had, it's harder to taste through the vinosity of it now, but it was always defined very much like Heights Martha's was, about having this sort of minty, cineol, eucalyptol sort of character that helped push it into popularity. I know an entire generation of BV drinkers, Private Reserve drinkers, who drank this and over the Latour, right, and over the less expensive wines, only because they could always pick up the eucalyptol in the wine, the mintiness in the wine, and that actually helped. Very much like Martha's Vineyard has a very distinctive minty character to it. That was one of the first things people could identify. So, I can, because when they could do it, what did they look like in front of their friends? Oh, you're going to love this slightly minty character in that. And that's true to the day, by the way, in some of the Australian wines. When people can find that character, it's a bragging point for them. And I think that helped. The wine clearly stands on its own 2 feet and is an incredibly interesting wine, but it's an interesting, again, accompanying story. So now let's talk about sort of the modern renaissance going on. So now people are, and again, we're kind of jumping back and forth. I apologize when you do a history thing. It's kind of how they do it. Actually, if you notice that most movies and TV series this way are made that way, you start in a moment, then you go back, then you get back up, then they bring you back to that moment, then they bring you again, then they take you to the future, then they bring you to... That seems to be like the TV movie formula these days, right? And there's a name for it, which is escaping me right now. And I didn't pattern my thing after this, but that's kind of the way I think about it. So anyway, 60s and 70s. Winemakers are going there. Wine grape growers are going there. The potential in Cabernet and Sauvignon and Chardonnay and even Rhone varieties and things like we'll talk about, people are becoming compelled to start wineries. Now, I remember being old enough to remember, I told you the story about driving in wine countries when there was nobody to visit, right? Driving to a lot of these old winemakers and going to visit them who were all selling. There was no retail by then, right? People weren't putting wines in restaurants and things like that. You would go up there, you'd talk with them, you'd chat with them, you'd have to make a very special trip up there. They, by the way, didn't have tasting rooms. More often than not, you were in somebody's living room, tasting with them and stuff like that. You would do it, but over time, things started to grow. People started to get excited, and we referred to this as sort of the wave, beginning when I had my restaurant, Square One Restaurant, which opened up in 1984. A lot of the wines that we were looking into early on were wines coming out of the late 60s, early 70s, wines which we wanted to populate on our list. We wanted to be known as sort of being a California destination list. Now, back then, those of you who are old enough to remember, if you went out to dine in a city like San Francisco, it was sort of like, or most restaurants in the United States, it was very Euro heavy, a lot of Bordeaux, some Burgundy, mostly Chablis, right? There was your token Piece Porter Gold Tropschen, right? There was your token Chianti Classico. There was Chateauneuf du Pape, because people just like to say it. There was Vouvray, because people figured out how to pronounce it. There was Puy-Fuissé, that people ordered because they sounded cool. Oh, you should try the Puy-Fuissé, not Puy-Fussy, like a lot of people were saying it back then. And then there was California wine. And California wine was generic, usually came in magnums. And the first people, as we move into this here, to come in to really start looking at that at the quality level from places like Napa Valley were Robert Mondavi. And for those people that remember the very first wine, they were sold in magnums, Napa Valley Red, Napa Valley White wines and stuff like that. But it helped shepherd in and bring attention to a category that others followed. I mean, yes, there were some unusual people like Dave Benyon and Paul Draper at Ridge who had started earlier, but this was really sort of the shepherding in of the era. And when we opened up our restaurant, we looked at it and we said, that's our wave. We're going to catch that wave. We're going to do it. We're going to base our wine list on California wineries. So I literally, back in 1982, would drive up to go see Joe Swan, would drive up to see Old Man Raffinelli, drive up to get way drunk on too much tequila with Mike Collini up at Stony Hill or whatever. By the way, I could tell you some Mike Collini stories later, but that's a whole different thing. And anyway, but that's how you got those wines, and to then be able to give people platforms for which the public could then finally try the wines, gave the platform that California wines, not just me, people started doing it that we deserved at that point in time. So in 1966, obviously, Mondavi left Krug, established his winery, really became the first major winery in Napa Valley in a post-Prohibition era. Not much had changed since then, and really started to do it. Now, he made his first trip into Bordeaux just a few years earlier and said, we need to do these things. We need to be that. And really wanting to, as anybody who ever read Robert Mondavi and would talk to him, we need to be taken alongside the great wines of the world. I mean, we all love Bob, right? But he would do this, and that was his mission. That was his mantra, to do that. And he started making wines, and he brought there. And people forget that, his first two winemakers were Warren Winiarski and Mike Gergich, right? The two people who went on to do, you can't underestimate what he did there. Obviously, a lot of the work that he led, the influence that he had, led to the Judgment of Paris. We'll talk about that a little bit later. For those of you who are not familiar with this, you've got to do that. But, go back and look. It's really amazing. And if you go back and delve into some of the books, Spurrier's book and all that, learning about how the tasting was actually conducted. We did a dinner on this last time, was amazing. We can't do the dinner again because a big anniversary is coming up and they don't want to get rid of the wines. Let's move forward. Let's move to the Paris tasting. And let's go to wine number 9, is Bacigalupi's Russian River Chardonnay. Now you're wondering, now Evan, what the hell does this have to do with the Paris tasting? Well, the wine was made at Chateau Montelena, wasn't it, Evan? Yeah, of course it was made at Montelena. But a good chunk of the fruit that came from that came from Sonoma. Sonoma was quickly gaining a reputation for its Chardonnay. And in searching for great Chardonnay, then Mike Gergich was looking around and doing stuff like that and trying to figure out. And he said, he drove over the hill. He was working at consulting at Montelena, and he went over the hill and he was tasting different Chardonnays all over the place. And he tasted this wine with the Bacigalupis. And Helen, who is 99 years old, God bless Helen, she turned 99 2 weeks ago, tasted with him, and he said at the time, this is the best Chardonnay he had ever had in California, and he wanted to bring it over the hill to Montelena and put it in the Chardonnay, which would go on to then win, as we know, the Paris Judgment. So that area of the vineyard, which is still an active part of the vineyard, is referred to as the Paris block. It's less than 2 hectares, and that's the wine that Mike did. Now it is still producing fruit there. Not as much, not as prolifically as it used to be, but if you ever see anything, you ever go over there, if you ever go taste with them, and needless to say, after word got out, how many Bacigalupi Chardonnays are there now, right? This is one of the leading vineyard-designated wines made in the state of California, and it's all because of just this sweet little old lady doing her thing. Anyway, to get the fruit there, after he called her and he said he wanted it, she literally packed it up, put it in her truck, drove it over Petrified Forest Road down there, and that's how they actually got it. Amazing pedigree. All of the wines are just a kiss TCA'd a little bit. Taste through it. We picked the three best that we had, and some of them are a little, I mind them when I have right now, but more importantly, taste through the pedigree, taste through the texture, taste through the what's going on there, and really appreciate what is, one of the Grand Cru vineyards of California today. And just to show you that I have a connection to the Judgment of Paris, that's me and Helen, God bless her, on the right at the very first Sonoma County wine auction. And that's me and Stephen Spurrier before he passed, about a year or two before that. And two people who I consider to be near and dear friends. And don't forget, as we spend the time in an industry that we love and that we're privileged to be in, the great people that make up the industry and make it so special, and the contributions that they all, and you all, bring to the table as well too. Then there was Bob, and we sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but obviously Bob left his family winery in ~65, founded his in Oakville with two partners that we don't hear about that often. He eventually bought them out, and the initial purchase was for less than 5 hectares of the vineyards that are now where the winery is, the offices are, that are under massive construction when you drive by these days today, and became the heart of it. The first new winery, as I said before, since Martini had been established back in 1933. Before that, yes, Martini, as I said before, was really the precursor of wines being labeled varietally, but it really word didn't get out. Robert Mondavi was our first great ambassador. I mean, truly, not only a great ambassador for the Robert Mondavi winery, but Napa Valley's great ambassador. Everybody else was more modest, quieter about it. He was out there bullishly pushing it to anybody who would talk about it, right? And started a lot of things that we know today. We started, again, pushing varietal bottling. He started styles of wine that he went to. He made Fumé Blanc, in the style of wine of a Puy-Fumé to basically designate a dry style of Sauvignon Blanc. Most of the Sauvignon Blanc that was being made at that point in time went into a sweeter styled wine called what? Sauterne without an S. And even the Sauvignon Blanc that was out there was sweet at the time. So he quickly took over all the profits, bought all of the hectares adjacent to Tocolone and all that, and then literally started to do all these cool things. The whole thing with the Rothschilds, Opus One, that first JV, opened up all these new efforts and pioneering things. More often than not, when you look at something, it's like, God, that's new. In the modern era, it was him. He did it and all that, and you cannot underestimate not just production, not just the pride, not just the quality, but what a lot of people don't know about Robert Mondavi after that historic trip in '62, going over to Bordeaux and bringing back all these things, where he single-handedly helped define and redefine distribution as we know it, working through sales, promotions, all of that stuff, and helping get wines into the mouths of people who happened not to be in driving distance of wine country and could pick their wines up at cellar door. Getting wines into the vernacular and all that, Mondavi and Gallo were really the first two people to focus on doing that, and that should be appreciated and rewarded. I think like all wineries of lineage and all wineries as they go through growing pangs and all that, there are up periods and down periods, difficult periods and all that. There's generational family things that percolate through family-owned wineries. There's opportunities that happen and don't happen. There's differences within families and stuff like that. And then some people will go through a difficult period and come back. I will tell you what Mondavi is doing in the last 8 to 10 vintages is back on track to where they were. They went through some tough times. And when they went public, difficult things there, family stuff that they had to go through. But ever since they've righted the ship in the last 10 years or whatever, wines are as good as they have ever been. Arguably, in some cases, better than they have ever been. So no, I don't think that's a criticism. I think it happens to all of us. I think it happens in your life. I think whether it's your family or friends, you go through up periods and down periods and do all of that. But I think that happened. I think that it happens with so many names and things like that. And then there are people that do. I think there are some wineries that are better today than they were when they got started too, right? And I think if you look at a winery, let's take another example of that. Louis Martini, pioneer, precursor, couple of difficult things, better wines than they've ever been. Arguably the best wines that have ever been made at Martini are being made right now. So we have to walk through lineage and stuff like that, and that's true in every part of the world, I think. So this wine is from 1976. 1976 was the first of 2 drought year vintages. A lot of people weren't sure how these wines were going to do. Bob really felt that whether it was the nature of the drought or whatever, something about the Cabernet Sauvignon was particularly terrific. And so he bottled this 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. To the time that was done, this was the first and only wine that was ever 100%. All the others were using the Bordeaux models, blends of Cabernet Merlot, Cab Franc, etc. First wine that he made was Cabernet. I don't know how many after that he made too, but I think it's still showing deliciously well. And again, speaking to that older style. So wine 10. So now let's taste wine 11. So this comes from Schaefer. So Schaefer Hillside Select is arguably one of the modern day classics, Napa Valley's most revered legacied Cabernet Sauvignon based wines. And I think that bottles like this, when they're shining, when they're special, when they're showing well, and the beauty of a tasting like this that we're doing today is that the biggest single thing that you have to worry about when you purchase, retail or restaurant, an older bottle of wine is not knowing where it came from. Right? What is the provenance of this wine? I remember when we started wine auctions in the state back in the 80s, and the only house was Christie's. Michael Broadbent came over and did it himself, worked with Michael Hart, who eventually started Hart Davis Hart and all that. And I became very good friends with Michael Hart because he was putting all the catalogs together. And if you saw a lot and you wanted to buy it, and it was older wine, the first thing you did was you called up Michael and you said, "Where'd this wine come from? What can you tell me about how many people have owned it? What was the quality of storage, etc." And he would steer you away from lots, and he would steer you towards lots and things like that. So we know that one of the most important things on a wine is its provenance. And we're so fortunate today to have these wines literally going from the cellars of the wineries and back to us. When I tasted with Peter Mondavi Krugs back into the 40s that had never moved, they were so fresh and so wonderful because literally it was 100 yards from where we were tasting it to all that. So I do hope that you take these moments as being able to literally ingest the history of the time, and again, thinking about where you were and all that too. And 76 for a lot of people, 76 BV Private Reserve, arguably along with the 74, the best one that they made there. 76 was sort of an overshadowed, a lot of people just thought because of the drought, could be weird wines and all that. But even then, alcohol's modest and all that stuff too. I don't think you can underscore the importance of this being sort of emblematic of the early 70s in Napa Valley and the push of estates, and whether it was Schaefer or Clos Duval or Whitehall Lane or a number of estates that came on at this period of time and really kind of hit the turbo into bringing Napa Valley into a forefront of what it could be. And we always say there's three kinds of wineries: new ones, legacied ones, and out of business ones, right? And it's very easy, you can only be new once. Wineries that go out of business are often out of business for a reason, but those that carry on, that have legacies, that go back, in the case of Schaefer, into the 70s and stuff like that, Mondavi into the 60s, are there for a reason. They're there to do that and to keep doing good things. Not only shows you the pedigree of what they're doing and why a lot of the people who come into that, whether it's the case of a Constellation or here in the case of Schaefer, many of you know that people are figuring it out. A lot of people are coming into California and going, hey, we need to be here too. And it used to be people going in and buying Bordeaux chateaus, investing in Burgundian properties, doing that. Now we have people coming into California, even going into, God forbid, Virginia, buying American wines because the quality of American wines today is so awesome. So Shinsegae, who is in Korea and is just an awesome operation. And I just did a program in Korea with the people from Shinsegae. By the way, they have a wine floor in their flagship store in Gangnam that rivals Harrods for one floor of wines with everything you can possibly imagine. And then, as they always say on the infomercial, but wait, there's more. Turn around the corner, go there. But they decided that they wanted to be players, and they had literally targeted Schaefer as a winery to do that. And I think that this is sort of part of, not only do they have the resources to support the project and invested reportedly $250 million to do it, but it speaks to wanting to keep the quality there, wanting to represent that jewel. And they're not alone. So part of what you're seeing in a lot of these classic areas is whether it's AXA buying the Platte Vineyard, one of the great vineyard sites that we have, whether it's Phelps being purchased by LVMH, whether it's Mary Edwards or Diamond Creek being purchased by Roederer. it's international people recognizing the quality of what we're doing and the opportunities that exist too. So I think that's a really cool thing. Wine 11 is the Hillside Select. They went out and were kind enough to pull a 2001 for us. They're an extraordinary property. Elias Fernandez is one of the great jewels of our wine industry, and literally since Doug Schaefer stopped making the wine on the day-to-day, has been their lone winemaker. Not that many people can say they've had essentially two winemakers for their entire existence, and one who is still active and who publicly, even after the winery was sold, said he wanted to stay on. He wanted to carry through the lineage. He wanted to make it happen. And the wines are incredible. The wine itself is a selection, as you know, of various hillside estates that they have, selected plots that they have in Stag's Leap. So again, hillsides are relative in Stag's Leap. It's a slightly flatter thing. Obviously, you've got the little hillside up there where the original Mondavi home is behind Silverado. But this is a combination of Sunspot, John's Folly, Rattler Blocks, a couple of others that have been kind of the hallmark of this. What's amazing to me is here's a wine that's 23 years old. Aside from the fact that it still looks much younger than that, there's a freshness in this wine. Yeah, very fruit driven. You would not think that this wine is there. Now, part of that is clearly seamless use of French oak there and in a good amount of it, but part of it is a pedigree of fruit that is undeniable in that wine that can handle not only 100% brand new French Bordeaux barrels, but also do so for 32 months and still have the fruit come through like that. 23 years later, when so many wines at that point in time taste like what? Wood and nothing else. I think that wine is remarkable. Schaefer's wines are like that. And I don't know what sort of magic fairy dust that John and Doug and Elias have sprinkled on that property over the years, but all of them, whether it's the Chardonnay, whether it's that, they all have an incredible freshness about them. Let's move on a little bit like that. So now I told you I was going to go back. Unlike a TV series I talked about. So let's go back here. So I just wanted to show you that I wasn't making it up and pulling it out of a Cracker Jack box. So this is 1971, and if you look at the fruit profile of red grapes back then, or grapes in general, top 60 grapes, it was Carignan was our number one grape by a decent amount, followed by Zin, followed by Grenache, very much all together. Chardonnay was number 19. Merlot was 50. Cabernet was 8, but growing. So again, just to show you how recent things like this were, and a lot of those weird white grapes still there. Where's my friend Green Hungarian? Probably still there on there somewhere nice. All right. So modern age, this is my contemporary era, right? So back in the 70s, we started talking about these new wineries showing up and all that other thing. The other thing that started really happening here at this time were single vineyards, vineyard designation, single plots started to develop. Now, some people started earlier. People like Al Bronstein in Diamond Creek. If you're a fan of Diamond Creek, you know that there are 4 distinctively different plot wines made off of that property. But then, you had people like Paul Draper and Montebello. You had Joe Phelps and Isley and Bacchus and all these other things. Steve Kistler doing that stuff. And then for me in Pinot Noir, we started talking, really the first people to do vineyard designation in Pinot Noir were the old folks from Acacia. Jerry Goldstein, Larry Richmond, Mike Richmond rather, Jerry Goldstein, another Goldstein, and Larry McKenna. They were all making wines. They literally had they opened up the doors, they had 9 Pinot Noirs on day one. Madonna, this one, that one. So all that stuff. That's a relatively recent advent that goes back just literally only 50 years. In 1972, for those of us who were here, launched off the era of what we called the French Connection in sparkling wine. And this was led by Domaine Chandon, which then became Chandon and has become again Domaine Chandon, which really reflected the whole idea of Chandon's literally global thing. There's a Chandon everywhere in the world now, isn't there, right? Of what they were doing in California. Not only did they come into some skeptics, corporate French people coming in, they opened the door along with, for other people to come in, whether it was Domaine Carneros, Maison Deutz, Domaine Mum, which is now Mum Napa Valley, but also gave stages and platforms beyond Schramsberg that clearly already had a history, but people like Iron Horse and all that who started coming in and following and are developing our own domestic production of sparkling wines on our own without French so-called, fairy dust on it. And sparkling wine here in California is no different than anywhere else in the world. One of the only still growing categories and growing fast, and people who just only made table wine, still wine, over the last couple of years. In the last 8 to 10 years, if you're not making a sparkling wine, you're not in the game. So a lot of wineries are now doing custom production at places like Brick and Mortar, at places like Cruise, et cetera, folks who can literally offer them the opportunity to make small lots of sparkling wine and add them to their label, because everybody needs one today. So that happened. Then in 1978, Parker came about. And Parker, from a criticism standpoint, was arguably as big for us as he was for 82 in Bordeaux. He became famous for us, literally catching lightning in a bottle and doing that. But one of the things that could be said, and a lot of people like to argue that there were a lot of downsides. I will tell you one thing. I remember vividly 3 times a year when he would come out from Moncton, Maryland to California to meet with the California producers. And he would hold court, God bless him, at Table 7 at Square One Restaurant with varying people that would come through. There was nobody that loved California and was a bigger advocate for California in the early days than Bob Parker. And I think that for as easy as it is to throw stones in glass houses, he did amazing stuff, and he still loves California wines, and still, even though he doesn't own The Advocate anymore, doesn't own all that, he's still done some great things. He actually helped change things, not necessarily for what a lot of people feel is the better, but phenolic ripeness, yield levels being lower, 1, 2, bigger wines, more concentration, more new barrels, pluses and minuses, vineyard designatings, all sorts of things. So again, we have to recognize that that was part of the history and the growth of what was going on in California. Then in the 80s, fun things, go into your Wayback Machine. The emergence of fighting varieties and the so-called fighting varietal era. And fighting varietals were defined in the early 80s as being cork finished rather than plastic or cheap screw cap finished bottles that looked like fine wine, that were popular priced, and that you could buy in supermarkets, and led by offerings like Glen Ellen, Round Hill, Mondavi's Woodbridge, Fetzer's Sundial, Sutter Home's lower end, all these things going on. These were pushing. This got wine into the households, into the mouths of people who thought wine was hoity-toity, wine was not for them. All of a sudden, varietally labeled, cork-finished wines were popular and able to be purchased at that time, $4, $5, $6 a bottle. You could do that, $3 to $5 a bottle. White Zinfandel came out of that era. Then in the 80s, the small winery explosion happened, and that's when we started to see arrivals of wineries from William Selliam to Hirsch. I mean, admittedly, starting a little bit earlier, Talley, Eberly, Spots, Dunn, Spotswood, all these things, boom, 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 started happening, but really gaining popularity and recognition in that period of the 80s. In the late 80s, the Meritage category was formed. So Meritage, which as we know is the combinations of the word merit and heritage, not meritage, it's not heritage, right? Meriting wines came giving people an opportunity who wanted to break the box and not necessarily make Cabernet or Sauvignon Blanc driven or Semillon driven wines in the model of, well, it has to have a varietal label, as much a push back against fighting varieties as that had those wines made. And that's when you started to see Insignia and Opus One and Trilogy and all these wines started to happen. And this category still exists today, and there's still wines labeled Meritage today. By the way, there was a contest, many of you know, to name the category, and everybody was invited to put their things in. Meritage won. The prize was one case from each of the wineries for the next 40 years of that. I don't know if they ever delivered on that prize or not. All right, we move on. 1990s, the modern swell builds into cult wines. Screaming Eagles, Dalaval, Colgans, Sine Qua Non, all of that. Boom, boom, boom. That period happens, and it's just rocking and rolling. Then we moved further into the 80s, so now let's look at it at a higher level. So grapes are now planted in over half of the counties in California, not all. Today we know there are 49, but it wasn't even as recent as the 80s, it was only half. This wine thing caught on and has grown. By 1991, there were more than 50 AVAs approved in California. That's amazing, except the fact that you now know that there are 154. So we've added on 104 more, and there are more in the pipeline coming through. By 1997, the number of wineries in California grew to more than 1,000. This has been a fast track in the recent years. And this isn't even deep diving. I probably now, you always forget your points afterwards, but so much of the innovation in technology and winemaking today, a lot of what you're going to see and we'll talk about with what's going on in the vineyards, managing transpiration by literally by vine, by row, by drone, etc. Things as straightforward that we think have always been around, like stainless steel fermentation, cold fermentation, are all these things came out of California in this very short period of time. In 2002, the Wine Institute and the growers introduced this code of sustainable wine growing, covering more than 200 practices that are covered off in the vineyard, in the community, the people piece of it as well too, which we so often unfortunately forget, in the winery, etc. Huge piece of what we're doing, now going into over 20 years of being ingrained in the DNA of what we do. 2005, 21 million people come into the wineries every single year. Then there were only 4,100 wineries. Today, 4,500, right? We talked about today. So tourism becoming a big frickin' deal there. And enotourism is one of the few bright spots that we're seeing there today as visiting wineries, going to wineries, experiential elements of what's going on in the wine industry today. Globally, I might add, not just in California, is a huge way for us to connect with future generations and regain the love that, it's easy to fall in love. It's easy to kind of fall out of love too, and you got to remind yourself what brought you there in the first place. Sometimes simply going back to where you started and doing that, retasting the wines, be it a region, be it a winery, whatever, is part of that. 2008, U.S. wine exports, 90% coming from California, surpass $1 billion. Increasingly, a very important part of what we do, great efforts, incredible talent behind it, but speaks as well to the quality of the wines. When I was living in Paris in 1978 through 1977, 78, cooking in a funky little bistro in the 9th arrondissement by the Notre Dame de Lorette, and living there and meeting and hanging out, with people, and going to wine stores or going to restaurants and seeing what was available in California wine, it made you cringe. People, it was kind of like, here people would buy Lancers bottles, dump out the wine, put the Lancers bottle on the window, put flowers in it, that people didn't know what we were doing. People didn't see what we were doing. And so it's great that over time they are. The quality of wine speaks for themselves. The export is there. If you look at the quality of California offerings on renowned restaurant beverage programs throughout the world today, and I judge the best wine list in Australia competition, I judge the best one in China competition too, and the sections on California wines and the quality of the selections in California wines not only speaks great hat tips, beret tips, sombrero tips, whatever tips, every tip, to what people are doing who run those programs. It also shows you, because of the quality of what we're doing and the interest of people in the market, the access of the kinds of wines that they have today. So I think that's just really killer. 2010, we become the #1 wine consuming nation on earth. We still hold that by volume and by value, not necessarily per capita, for boatloads of reasons. I think we fall after Malta and places like that in per capita consumption, but we are Waterloo. That's why we are so, if you're a drinker of wine in the United States of America, you can have anything, anywhere, all the time. And one of the things that Honor and myself and Kate and everybody in California work on all the time is how do we maintain our leading edge and our market share in our own market, right? Because everybody else, wants to gain our market share because this is the most profitable, best market to be in here. We're still the #1, and we're going to maintain that. In 2022, Capstone is launched, an effort to support our efforts of what we're doing educationally for all of you as you support our efforts all over the world. But I remind people here, the number of people that I get, the number of winery tasting rooms of which going through Capstone Level 1 and 2 is part of their mandated staff training is huge, because if they don't know what's going on in California, that's kind of scary. So we've got a whole generation of people within the United States, professionally at various levels, who are going through this program as well too. And all of this is made possible in support by the California Wine Institute, the belief that people like Honor and Kate have in what we're doing from an educational basis. And of course, these things can't happen without the support of, as they would say on National Public Radio, friends and supporters like you. So thank you for being the best part of what we do outside of the borders of the United States. And with that, we're going to have one more wine. And this is to simply show you again this kind of forward think. Now, why would I show you this wine? Well, Marin County is not an AVA. Marin County is a place that not that long ago, people would have said, hot tubs, a lot of rich people, not a lot of wine going on except consumed in the hot tubs, right? But people forgot that because of the cool climate areas, in areas like Olima, in areas surrounding going up the coast, etc., Nicasio, places like that, there's wine being made. And this particular property, the Devil's Gulch property, is an amazing property. By the way, it's a farm. Not only do they grow grapes, but there's great rabbit that comes off this property. There's all sorts of other things too. But it's rural Marin County. It's 30 minutes away from San Francisco. It's way too cold to do anything, yet I'll let the wine speak for itself. Now, part of this, climates are changing and things like that in a lot of areas that were historically thought of as too cold. Ask Jasmine, when you see her later this week, how everybody told her father was an idiot for going up and planting stuff there, or Walton Joan Flowers, how insane they were there. These are now the cutting edge spots of what we think about for cool climate viticulture. Marin's not far behind. Other spots not far behind that. So this is a Pinot Noir made by the Dutton Goldfield. Obviously, Steve Dutton and Dan Goldfield together working on this project, which they started in 1998, highlighting sites here. And I remember when they came out with the first vintage of this wine, I was like, Marin? And he went, oh yeah, Evan, you got to check this out. You got to go there. I said, I don't know. He goes, come to the winery. The winery's like located outside Sebastopol. He goes, you got to come try it. So I went up there, and Dan, by the way, make sure you've got like 4 hours to be there, because Dan, we love Dan, but Dan talks a lot. And he said, I'm going to show you that. We tasted this wine, and you tell me, this is a place that is supposed to be known for dairy, stuff like that. You can't grow grapes here. Look at that. That is one of the most precise, focused Pinot Noirs coming fair. And basically, they've kind of been caught in no man's land. Thank God the people from Sonoma have embraced Marin all these years and kind of taken them in there, but it's not that far away that they're going to definitely want their own personality and things like doing like that. So anyway, we finished with that wine. And with that, my pleasure. Thank you.
That wraps up our two-part deep dive into California wine history with Evan Goldstein, MS. From its early roots to the rise of Napa and Sonoma, we've seen how California has shaped itself into one of the world's most influential wine regions. But with everything happening in the world today, political shifts, trade tariffs, global warming, and even the growing movement towards low to no alcohol consumption, what does the future hold for California wines? Personally, I believe these challenges are part of a cycle. The wine industry has always faced hurdles, yet time again, it has proven its resilience. California wine has come a long way, not just in establishing its identity, but in cementing its place on the world stage. If history has shown us anything, it's that the industry will continue to adapt, innovate, and thrive. So what are your thoughts? Share them with me on Instagram at so.thirsty.traveler. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, my drinking comrades, remember, a drink always tastes better when a company clicks. Cheers.